Story 1. Dick Power, our local butcher, used to hang strings of sausages in his window. Story 2. Placid elderly oatmeal slap racial weather pot price merciful crawl. Story 3. A guy used to call me on the help desk where I worked whose name was Seven, the literal number 7. He called often enough, and we were friendly enough that I could finally ask him about it. Was that really on his birth certificate? Yes. Did he ever see that Seinfeld episode? Yes, it was based on him. Some writer knew his parents or something, and it inspired that episode of the show. He was really nice. 7. If you see this, you are always stuck in my memory. Story 4. We live near reserves and see people of native descent. They have interesting and cool names related to animals or actions, such as Wolfcaller, Hawk, and Firemaster. Story 5. So many children are named Hunter. I want to meet someone named Gatherer. Story 6. Street Lamp Lemoose. I also worked with a man named Dragon Hung. Story 7. I have a coworker named Tiberius, and my dad had a student named Rush. The latter was named after the Canadian band, not the conservative shock jock whose best contribution was his death. Story 8. Nightmare. The most metal surname I have ever encountered. Story 9. Ocean Cloud or John Smith. Honestly, to have the courage to name your child John when your last name is already Smith is unusual. Story 10. I have a friend called Blue. A pretty awesome name actually. Story 11. Electric Warrior. It is on his driver's license. That has been his family's name for over 100 years. Story 12. Went to college with someone named Jet Steel. He hated it, but I thought it was pretty cool. Story 13. Ai Weiwei. Boutros Ghali. Yo-Yo Ma. And someone I knew personally, a guy I worked with, named after his dad, Muhammad. Muhammad. For his middle name, he was named for his paternal uncle Muhammad. And his third given name was for his grandfather, Muhammad. Fully, Muhammad. I don't care to tell you about his cousin Ahmed. True stories. Not being bigoted. Story 14. Received an email from Tamara McNamara at work once. It flows beautifully. Story 15. I went to junior high with a guy named Jet. There was a Mona Lisa at that school too. Story 16. There is a man who plays for a National Collegiate Athletic Association sports team named Johnny Cool. His Instagram and other usernames are Johnny Cool 2, which is not true. Story 17. It is from a show called Lucifer. The last Morningstar episode feels different. Story 18. My son's middle name is Danger, so he can say the phrase, Danger is my middle name, and it is true. Story 19. My brother had a friend named Dustin Gunn. Sounded like a cowboy name to me. Story 20. A colleague was named John Vane, which was fun. I had 2 teachers with the last names Summer and Winter, and they got married. Story 21. I went to high school with a guy named Wade Ponce de Leon. I always thought it sounded like the name of a fictional action movie star. Story 22. Lord Philip, a man I met at university. I couldn't believe it when my professor called attendance for the first time. Story 23. In the 1970s, I was in the army with a man named George Washington and another man from the Boston area named Roy Rogers. Story 24. I love Persephone and Callie Rose, characters from the Noughts and Crosses series. Persephone is originally from Greek mythology. I just love the sound of both names and Sephi for short. Story 25. Vanilla Sundae. I thought that was pretty cool. She always signed her name with an ice cream cone and sunshine. Story 26. Claudia. I will name my daughter that. Sounds so cute. Story 27. Patrick Dangerfield, top-level Australian rules football player. Story 28. Wayne Kerr is a great name. Read it aloud to the person next to you for me. Story 29. Gallowglass. I saw it used in a book and looked it up. I found it surprisingly appropriate for the actual character, but even out of context, it just sounds like a name I want to say. Story 30. My next female cat will be Kali. I came across a female character with that name in a book and just love it for some reason. Siobhan is one of my favorite names. I love the way it sounds and feels. Story 31. Aleister Crowley was probably an unusual person to meet in person with all the witchcraft rituals, but I love his name. Story 32. Johnny Friday. I did not think it was real until he showed me his passport. Story 33. I met a young woman named Paisley, and I thought it was the most beautiful name instantly. Story 34. My first name is Rebel. Most people think it is a cool name. Story 35. There is a World Wrestling Entertainment wrestler whose real name is Thunder Justice Keck. He uses a less impressive ring name. Story 36. I always find it curious when people have matching first and last names. David Davidson, Peter Peterson, John Johnson, Stephen Stevenson. Story 37. I took a civil service exam, and the person above me was named Guy Blando. I decided that if I ever faked my own death, I would come back as a man with an impressive mustache and the name Guy Blando. Story 38. I work for a man named Richard Burns. He is unpleasant, but I believe his father is very funny. Story 39. In a previous job, I worked with a person named Sotiris Callicristus. I don't know why, but that name has stuck with me for over a decade. There is something about it that is very cool. Story 40. Tony Hawk is a pretty cool name. It is almost impossible not to be cool when named Anthony Hawk. Story 41. Dwayne Pipe is probably my favorite. I am not sure if it would be considered cool, but I personally love it. Story 42. I'm drawn to Harper for either male or female, probably due to my fondness for Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird. Story 43. Cyril, like the alphabet. He was such a cool guy. I always thought it would be a great name for a boy. I also always thought Cyrus, like the Great, was an awesome name too, but I have never met a modern Cyrus. Story 44. A man I work with has legally changed his name to Rocket. I thought that was pretty cool. Rocket Richardson. Story 45. Ambrose. I have only heard it once and thought it was cool for a guy. Story 46. Work at a bank. One of my clients' names is Danny Ocean. Freaking sweet. Another dude's surname is Yezerski, which I always thought was cool. Story 47. My friend's name was Dragan, which is a very common and boring name in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. But try pronouncing it in English. Story 48. Shona is a French girl in high school. She has a unique name and is a pretty girl. Story 49. Oh man, this is easy. 48-year-old married father of two in the United Kingdom here. I was just thinking about this the other day. I worked with a colleague who was born in Poland and went by Eric. I loved working with him, best project manager I ever met. After working with him for a year, I heard him talking to human resources and gave his full name. His brother was called Arcadius. Phonetically Arcadius for us Anglophones. A full ancient Greek superhero of a name, Arcadius. I asked him if I could use his full name because it was spectacular. Best name I ever heard. Story 50. Wolf. I named my son that. Luckily, he is not a small kid. Story 51. I met a man named Grocery. I thought it was strange, but also like, hey dude, yo. Story 52. Megatron Bison. I am guessing he changed his name to that. I never met him, but he worked at the same place as I did. His name used to make me smile when I saw it on emails. Story 53. Played against a wide receiver in my semi-professional days, and his name was Jet Swiftwater. Still the coolest name I have ever heard. Story 54. I worked at a liquor store and had a regular customer named Rex Gunn. I thought, wow, that is the most film noir thing I have ever experienced. If that man did not own a seedy detective agency, it was a huge missed opportunity. I literally wish that was my given name. Story 55. I used to work with a man named Nash. I thought it was a cool name. Story 56. Knew and worked with men called Steel Bromer and Saber King. Story 57. Not to my credit because it was my husband's idea, but our daughter is named Holiday. Everyone loves it, and it just suits her. I would never have thought to name her that. I was fine with Holly. I once knew a little girl named Rocky. I thought it was silly at the time, but then I met her, and I cannot imagine her being named anything else. She was a stubborn, old little kid, and I adored her. Story 58. I knew someone in elementary school named Christian St. James. He was the best name. Story 59. Back when we were trying to sell our house, the showing agents left their cards on the kitchen counter. One of them was Richard Muncher. Story 60. I really enjoy this Russian banana inspector's name, Aladuiz Goofoff. Story 61. Childish Gambino. He got it from a random name generator. I knew a girl called Teresa Green. Story 62. Ibanez Fontaine, a friend of my husband's, did improv with him some years ago. I'm sure it was rough as a kid, but as an adult who was a hilarious improv and comedic performer with his own style, I thought it sounded so cool. Story 63. I dated a man named Leo Dagger. I always thought that was a pretty cool name. Story 64. I met a family on vacation recently that had a daughter named Futura. Story 65. I actually know a person named Cengiz Khan. First name Cengiz, middle name Khan. He is a Dutch man and quite eccentric. Story 66. Trent Alexander-Arnold has to be on my top 10 coolest names. Story 67. I went to elementary school with a boy named Zygmunt. We all called him Ziggy. Between the name and his personality, he was just awesome. I have wondered a few times how Ziggy is doing. I hope life has been kind to him and that he stayed wild. Story 68. Knew a bartender whose legal first name was Hollywood. She was the very coolest. Kept her identification handy because people were always asking her to prove it. Story 69. Seamus. I met a guy doing tattoos in someone's living room at a huge high school party, and that was his name. I remember saying, cool name, famous Seamus. And then I named my son that about 5 years later. Story 70. Gisela. Gizela. Sounds like a monster from the old Godzilla movies. Story 71. I liked what Prince did when he made his name a symbol as a means to control his music. Genius. Story 72. I previously did some call center work. My job involved taking incoming calls from existing customers and addressing their inquiries. I don't remember the exact inquiry, but I was impressed by the customer's name, Max Corp. I thought to myself, he would make a good Superman villain. Story 73. Vikram Singh Rathore was the name of my uncle. He was very brave and served in the Navy. He used to tell me interesting stories about the sea. Some of them were even true. Once, he told me about the Kraken and how it attacked their ship. Their captain fought the Kraken one-on-one with a sword and a pistol, buying time for them to escape. These stories felt very real to 7-year-old me. One time, he told me about dating a beautiful mermaid who really liked seafood and how he saved her from an evil fisherman. It turned out she was a real woman he met overseas, and they later got married. Whenever I hear that name, I immediately associate it with bravery and heroism. Story 74. A man who owned the ice cream shop in my hometown has the legal name Flex Youngblood. Story 75. There is a customer at my job named Araselvi. I have always thought her name was very unique. Story 76. Used to work with a man named Tom Gunhouse. He is a nice person and currently a lawyer. If you are in the United Kingdom, you could be represented by Tom Gunhouse. Story 77. A man with the last name Stain served in the Canadian Navy. 10 years ago, he was a master seaman. I bet the recruiters saw him coming and knew they had to put him in the Navy. I never got his first name or even an initial. Story 78. Anastasia. I wanted to name my daughter this, but I was outvoted. Story 79. The quarterback for the University of Louisiana at Monroe is named General Booty. His middle name is Axel. General Axel Booty. Story 80. I thought Seth was the coolest name ever as a kid. I still kind of do. A lot of my favorite people are named Seth. Story 81. I had a Sri Lankan friend growing up. I met his uncle named Sean Connery. Sean was pronounced as Scene. Story 82. Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller has a child named Moxie Crimefighter. I always thought that was pretty cool. Story 83. No name because she said she could not think of a name for her. Story 84. I loved Keanu and he is still beautiful. I did not name my son Keanu because my family teased me. Story 85. When I lived in Chicago, there was a pair of siblings named Clark and Addison. Story 86. I knew a guy named Dallas Duke. I used to call him the coolest dude in the class. Story 87. After watching Gladiator, nothing will be cooler than Maximus Decimus Meridius. Story 88. The name of one of my mom's friends is Celeste. It is a color, light blue, but it also means heavenly. A friend of mine is called Sol, which means sun. One of my coworkers' nicknames is Orso, which means bear in Italian. Story 89-1. I will spell it as it is pronounced. Manewa. South African origin. My son is on a recreational baseball league here in the United States, and there is a kid on another team named Manewa. His father, who is white and American-born, was a coach on an opposing team. I kept hearing his name called out during a game once, and I loved it so much I walked over after the game and asked the coach about him, the origin, and told him I absolutely loved it. He said his wife, who is black, is South African and chose the name. Sadly, I forgot the meaning, but I am pretty sure it was something powerful. 2. Emerald. There is ruby. There is pearl. Opal, amber, and I have heard and disliked diamond. But I recently met an emerald, a little girl, and raved to her parents about how much I loved the name. Classy, unique, but not too strange. Story 90. Dick Stoneburner also gave me the legendary quote, "I don't need a crutch. If your beer gets warm, you're not drinking fast enough," when I asked if he wanted a koozie for his beer. Story 91. I am a teacher, and one of my students a few years ago was named Farron. She is Greek. I have always thought it is one of the most beautiful looking and sounding names I have ever heard. I do not want children, but if I had a daughter, Farron would be at the top of my list of suggested names. Story 92. Preston Carpenter played for the Pittsburgh Steelers many years ago. Story 93. I used to teach. One kid's name was Spike Dangerfield. His brother's name was Gavin. Story 94. There is a sweet warmth in names like Dolores or Mercedes. Story 95. I worked with a Vietnamese man named Tuk. He liked to focus. Story 96. I broke my leg as a teenager, and my doctor's name was Chun Bong Choi. It was fun to say, especially since I grew up in a small farming town in the Midwest where we did not see many Asian people. Story 97. In my last place of work, there was a fellow senior manager called Knut Beekman, pronounced Knut. My line manager at the time was very surprised when I told him that my next introductory meeting was with Knut. We were both European, me from the United Kingdom, Knut from Belgium, but my line manager was American. Story 98. I work in a furniture store. One of the employees in the back is Joe Corona. A family was dorm shopping for their extremely tall and very sweet daughter. Her name is Sequoia. Story 99. Once, I met a man in the United States of America called Tom Cocaine. I did not believe him, but he showed me his passport. That was his name. To top it off, he was a high school teacher. He proved this as well, and I was laughing for 10 minutes straight. Poor fellow. Story 100. I knew an Asian man named In Yong, which was pretty cool. Story 101. Nanette, an excellent doctor, is the only person I have ever met with that name. Story 102. Johnny Diamond worked for a large commercial property agent. Story 103. Aviva Gabriella Khan. Heard that name and thought, wow, that is a moniker. Story 104. I was an Uber driver once and the driver's name was Marvelous. What a name. Story 105. I had a girlfriend in high school named Blair, and I always loved that name. If I ever change my mind about having children, that is what I would name my daughter. I also had a friend named Dane Wolf who was very impressive. Story 106. I met a lady about 10 years ago named Sage. I love her name. I told her it was cool, and she said she liked it because it reminded her of Sage of Halo from Ronin Warriors. That really made my day that she knew that anime. Story 107. I used to know a girl named Rocky. It was not short for anything, nor was it a nickname. She was very cool and stunningly beautiful, and somehow the name suited her perfectly. Story 108. My mom's friend named her daughter Tequila. She went by Tiki. I kind of liked it. Story 109. Ocean was so cool, and it went perfectly with her middle and last name. Story 110. Rafferty Lawless. Kid I worked with. Probably the coolest name I have ever come across. Story 111. A girl at school named Fallon. I just thought it was an unusual and pretty name. Story 112. So, I was very young when I had my son, who is now 17, and I really did not pay attention to actors and their names. My son is named Keaton Michael, and he was about 6 months old when someone asked me if I liked Batman. I was very confused by the question. I said no and asked why. The person was dumbfounded when I still did not understand. I told my family, and my dad, with the smirk of a man who has known the truth, just looked at me and said, "I thought you knew." No, I did not. Story 113. There is an artist named Uriel. I do not know what it means, but I think it is a beautiful name. Story 114. Name of a girl I read in a book when I was 12 and have always loved. Battle. Story 115. There is a character in The Pretender named Kerrigan. I loved the name so much that I named my oldest child after her. Story 116. I really like the name Tainai. I want to name my first daughter that. My partner said no, as it is too hard to pronounce. Finnish names tickle my brain in the correct way. Also, seeing English teachers trying to pronounce the YY sound makes me chuckle. It is pronounced Tune, according to Google Translate. Story 117. I went on a grand tour of Europe right after high school. The movie Eurotrip had an impact on me and my best friend. After about 15 minutes in Europe, we met a fellow American, a few years older than us. He looked like a bohemian guy who had some stories to tell. Long, cool hair, a bunch of patches on his backpack. Tall and muscular. You get the idea. His name was Titus, and my friend and I realized we were just a couple of short, nerdy guys. Eurotrip was not going to happen for us. Story 118. These two authors I absolutely adore write suspense thrillers. Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child, well, one of their characters, Aloysius Pendergast, is a main character in many of their books. There is just something so alluring about the name Aloysius. It sounds like a mystery all by itself. Story 119. We had a babysitter many years ago named Cat Outlaw. She was totally cool for a 12-year-old girl or anyone else. Story 120. I knew a man named Kendricks. I always thought that was a cool name. Story 121. I love reading the names on gravestones. I say good morning to Fanny Careless every day on the school run. Story 122. I loved the name Willow Dean from the movie Dumplin' with Jennifer Aniston. The girl went by Will for short, so cute. Story 123. I had a food representative at one of my restaurants whose name was Richard Hanger. Richard Hanger was hilarious. He always introduced himself as Richard, but his friends called him Dick Hanger or DH. Story 124. When I taught pottery at a children's camp, there was a child named Luke Savage. He was about 8 years old and already had long grunge-style hair. I thought that child is destined to be a rock star. My all-time favorite was my childhood best friend. Her name was Willow Forrest. At a doctor's office, I saw a man named Master DeAndre Pennycock called in for his appointment. Story 125. There is a Doom programmer who worked on the original Doom game, and his name is American McGee. Story 126. Eliezer is a Hebrew name that means God helps or God has helped. Story 127. I have always loved the name Artemis, and I thought if I ever had a daughter, that would be her name. Until I watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and realized I could never have a daughter whose name I would forever associate with Hi, I am Artemis. I have a bleached asshole. Story 128. Alaric and Enzo. I am 40 and have only just started watching The Vampire Diaries. Lovely names. Story 129. Gustas Velitis. A Lithuanian boy in my school when I was a child. It just seems like such a cool name. Story 130. My daughter used to go to school with a cute little boy named Jet. He had black hair and a sprinkling of freckles across the tops of his cheeks and nose. Story 131. I worked with a man named Reed Panther. He was part of the environmental unit, probably the coolest government job they had. Story 132. I met a woman in her 80s whose last name was Wolfslayer. Story 133. There was a student at my high school named Chevrolet Gray. The name just rolls off the tongue and has a nice swagger to it. Story 134. The local plumber in my small town was Joe Kohalik. He legitimately had a brother named Al. Story 135. This reminds me of the Impractical Joker skit where they read off ridiculous names in a lobby of patients. Maya Soul, which sounds like my asshole, was a name a fan from the show ended up giving their child because they thought it sounded pretty funny. Story 136. Someone once explained to me the benefit of having a last name beginning with AZ or any of the last letters of the alphabet. They were able to show up late to classes because roll calls typically go alphabetically. Granted, it meant they could only be late a few minutes, but for many of us, that could have been enough to slide by. Story 137. Buddy once talked to a man named Handsome Man. You cannot get much better than that. Story 138. Played basketball with a man named Rain. He was an excellent shooter from beyond the three-point line. Story 139. I knew a man named Rod Rambo. I wonder what ever happened to him. Story 140. Ross Stetson is a cool older gentleman who was a patient at the dental office where I worked for 27 years. Story 141. An Italian named Giuseppe Pertico came to Australia and became Joe Practical. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.